December 22, 1944, a snow-laced ridge near Foy, Belgium. Inside the M4A3 Sherman, Nebraska Avenger, the world was a deafening, frozen hell. The metallic clang of a German 75mm shell bouncing off their frontal plate rang through the crew compartment like a cathedral bell struck by a giant. The concussion wave punched the air from Art Miller's lungs. "Driver, reverse. Get us back." Sergeant Russo's voice was a raw, strained thing over the intercom. Art, crammed in the bowels of the tank as the driver, shoved the levers. The tank's engine, a massive Continental R975, roared in protest, but the tracks only chewed uselessly at the frozen mud and ice. They were stuck. "We're pinned, Sarge," Art yelled back, the words tasting of cold iron and fear. Through his periscope, Art had a fragmented, jittering view of the nightmare. A German Panther, its slab-sided gray hull a ghost in the falling snow, was positioned 300 yards away, hidden behind a shattered farmhouse. It was a predator, and they were its wounded prey. The smell was overwhelming, a nauseating cocktail of hot engine oil, spent cordite, and the coppery tang of blood from a gash on the loader's forehead. "Gunner Sabo, track that cat," Russo commanded. Art heard the frantic clatter as the loader, Private Riley, slammed the long, sleek armor-piercing round into the breech. "Up!" Riley yelled. "Fire!" Gunner Corporal Delgado pulled the trigger. A hollow, sickening clunk echoed through the tank. Not the world-ending roar of the 76mm main gun, but the sound of mechanical failure. "Breech is frozen solid," Delgado screamed, frantically working the handle. The recoil mechanism seized. "It's a goddamned brick." A cold dread, deeper than the Ardennes winter, seized Art. Their one tooth was pulled. The Sherman's .30 and .50 caliber machine guns were useless against the Panther's sloped armor. They were a 30-ton steel coffin. Outside, the whine of the Panther's turret traversing was an audible death sentence. Art watched through his scope as the long, menacing barrel of the German gun stopped its traverse. It was now pointing directly at them. He could almost see down the dark, unforgiving muzzle. This was it. This was the end of the line, in a frozen forest, a world away from the Nebraska sun. The memory hit Art with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the sight of the Panther's barrel, but the smell of hot metal and oil that triggered it. It transported him back to Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the sweltering summer of 1943. The first time he laid eyes on an M4 Sherman, he'd felt a strange sense of familiarity. It wasn't so different from the tractors he'd repaired back home, just bigger, deadlier, and infinitely more complex. Where other recruits saw a weapon of war, Art saw a machine. He understood its rhythms, the whine of its gears, the specific pitch of a healthy engine. He'd met his crew there. Sergeant Tony Russo, from the Bronx, all sharp edges and street-smart confidence. Corporal Luis Delgado, the gunner from Texas, with a cowboy's calm and a dead-eye's focus. Private Jimmy Riley, the loader from Chicago, a kid who never stopped talking. They'd been skeptical of the quiet farmer from Nebraska at first. But when Art diagnosed a misfiring engine by sound alone, or fixed a bulky traverse motor with a piece of wire and a prayer, their skepticism turned to respect. They became a family, a band of brothers sealed inside 30 tons of steel. At night, in the barracks, while Riley chattered about dames and Delgado polished his boots, Art would lie in his bunk and stare at the photograph of Clara. He could almost feel the Nebraska sun on his face, smell the clover on the wind, taste the wild honey his mother would leave on the windowsill. He'd made a promise. A promise of a house, a future, a life. That promise was a small, warm ember in his chest, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal machinery of war that surrounded him. The day they painted Nebraska Avenger on the tank's barrel, Art felt a surge of pride. He was bringing a piece of home to the fight. Then came the orders. Europe. The big one. They'd boarded a troopship in a grim, silent line, the scale of what was to come finally dawning on them. The vast, gray ocean mirrored the mood. The carefree days of training were over. They were heading into the crucible, and none of them knew if they would emerge on the other side. The memory of the ship faded, replaced by the visceral, present horror of the Ardennes forest. The German offensive had hit them like a sledgehammer. One day, they were in a quiet sector. The next, the sky was torn apart by screaming Stuka dive bombers and the relentless rumble of panzer columns. The weather itself had become the enemy. A thick, oppressive fog clung to the pine trees, reducing visibility to mere yards. The cold was a physical presence, a biting, malevolent force that seeped through their layers of wool and leather, numbing fingers and stealing breath. Art, as driver, had the worst of it. His position was down in the hull, his body pressed against the freezing steel floor. The cold shot up through the soles of his boots and into his bones. He navigated by faith, following the faint tail light of the tank in front of them, the world outside his periscope a swirling mess of white and gray. The sounds of battle were muffled, distant thumps and cracks that could mean a tree falling or a friend dying. The confusion was total. Radio traffic was a chaotic jumble of broken messages and frantic calls for help. They were part of a ragged column trying to reinforce a collapsing line near Bastogne. Nebraska Avenger was near the rear, its tracks slipping and grinding on the icy roads. Suddenly, the world ahead of them erupted. A brilliant orange flash, followed by the deafening crump of an explosion. The lead Sherman vanished in a fireball, lighting up the fog with a ghastly glow. Ambush! Ambush! Russo's voice cracked over the intercom. Driver, hard left. Get us off this road. Art wrenched the levers, steering the tank into the deep snow of the forest. Branches screeched and snapped against the hull. He could hear the distinct, rapid thump-thump-thump of a German MG-42, its rate of fire terrifyingly fast compared to their own Brownings. Tracers ripped through the fog, green and red lines of death searching for them. They fought back blindly, Delgado firing the coaxial machine gun at unseen muzzle flashes. After what felt like an eternity, the German fire ceased as quickly as it had begun. The fog closed in again, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the crackle of burning fuel and the moans of the wounded. They were alone, cut off from their company, lost in a white wilderness, hunted. For 2 days, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with German patrols. They'd found a defensible position on a wooded ridge overlooking a shallow valley, linking up with 2 other lost Shermans, Desert Devil and Yankee Doodle. The 3 tanks formed a shaky, triangular strongpoint. Their breath fogged inside the tank, condensing and freezing on the cold steel. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was systematically dismantling their machines. Art spent hours outside with a blowtorch, trying to keep the engine blocks from freezing solid. The gear oil was thick as tar. The .50 caliber machine gun on the turret had to be manually worked free each morning, its bolt frozen in place. But the most critical failure was yet to come. It was Riley who discovered it during a routine check. "Sarge," he said, his voice small. "The main gun. I can't move the breech block. It's locked up tighter than a drum." A wave of silence fell over the crew. The main gun was their reason for existing. Without it, they were a mobile pillbox, and a vulnerable one at that. Russo climbed out to look, his face grim when he returned, eyebrows coated in frost. "Delgado's right. The hydraulic recoil fluid is like jelly. The mechanism is completely seized. We're down to machine guns." The implication hung in the frozen air. They could hold off infantry, but the moment a German panzer showed up, they were dead. They all knew the stories of Shermans being torn apart by Tigers and Panthers, their shells bouncing harmlessly off the German armor while a single return shot could turn a Sherman into a molten tomb. Their own 76mm gun was their only chance, and it was now a useless piece of frozen metal. As if on cue, Delgado, who had his eye pressed to his telescopic sight, spoke softly, his Texas drawl taut with tension. "Sarge. Contacts. Tree line. South side of the valley. Infantry. Lots of M." Art swiveled his periscope. He saw them then, gray-green ghosts flitting between the dark trunks of the pines. A full squad, maybe more, supported by a heavy machine gun team. They were setting up. They were preparing to assault the ridge. And Nebraska Avenger had no way to fight back. "We can't let that MG get set up," Russo barked. "They'll pin the other tanks down and pick us apart. Delgado, can you hit the gun team with the cokes?" The machine gun rattled, but the range was extreme, and the German squad expertly used the terrain for cover. Tracers from the German MG-42 kicked up snow and dirt around their position. The ping-ping-ping of rifle fire ricocheting off their hull was a constant, unnerving reminder of their vulnerability. Art's mind raced, a frantic slideshow of mechanical failure and impending doom. The frozen breech. The seized recoil mechanism. A little honey can quiet the fiercest sting. His mother's voice, calm and certain, cut through the panic. It was insane. It was the stupidest idea in the history of warfare. But it was all he had. "Sarge!" Art yelled, his voice cracking. "I have an idea. It's gonna sound crazy. Crazy is all we've got, Miller. Spit it out." "Honey. I have a jar of my mom's honey in my pack. Back home, we used it to free up rusty tools, to lubricate stuff in a pinch. It doesn't freeze. It's thick, it's slick. It might work on the breech." The silence inside the tank was absolute, broken only by the distant rattle of small arms fire. Riley stared at him, his face a mask of blood and disbelief. "Honey? You want to fix a 76mm cannon with honey? Art, have you lost your goddamn mind? Do you have a blowtorch that can reach in there, Miller?" Russo asked, his voice dangerously calm. "No, Sarge. But I don't need one. The honey, it'll creep in. It'll lubricate. It's our only shot." Russo held his gaze for a long second, weighing the life of his crew on a farmer's folk remedy. He made the call. "Do it. Riley, help him. Everyone else, keep those infantrymen's heads down." Art scrambled to his personal stash, pulling out the small, wax-sealed mason jar. The golden, viscous liquid inside seemed absurdly out of place. He unscrewed the lid, and the faint, sweet scent of clover blossoms filled the foul air of the tank, a ghost from Nebraska. With Riley guiding him, Art smeared great globs of the honey onto the frozen metal components of the breech block and the recoil piston housing. It felt foolish, like anointing a king. "Now the manual crank," Art yelled. "Slow and steady." Delgado put his weight against the hand crank for the breech. He strained, muscles corded in his neck. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a sound that was less a crack and more a deep, resonant groan of protest, the mechanism moved. A fraction of an inch. Then another. The honey, forced into the microscopic gaps by the immense pressure, was doing its work. The frozen metal was waking up. "It's moving," Delgado shouted, a note of triumph in his voice. "It's stiff, but it's moving." The breech clanged open. Riley didn't need to be told. He slammed a high-explosive round home. Up. The breech slammed shut, the honey acting as a strange, sticky seal. "Target that MG nest," Russo commanded, his eyes glued to his vision blocks. The German machine gun team had found their range, and rounds were now consistently hammering their turret, a relentless, metallic drumbeat. Art held his breath. This was the moment of truth. Would the gun fire? Or would the seized mechanism cause a catastrophic misfire, blowing them all to pieces? Delgado took a breath, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The roar was the most beautiful sound Art had ever heard. It wasn't the clean bang of a healthy gun, but a deeper, wetter thump whoosh, as if the cannon had cleared its throat. The tank rocked back on its suspension. Through his periscope, Art saw the explosion. The He shell landed square in the center of the German machine gun position. Wood, snow, and dark shapes were thrown into the air. The relentless hammering on their turrets stopped instantly. A ragged cheer went up inside the Avenger. They were back in the fight. But their victory was short-lived. The roar of their main gun was a beacon. From the far tree line, behind the shattered farmhouse, a shape emerged. It was low, sleek, and deadly. The Panther. It had been waiting, listening. Now it knew their exact position and that they were operational. Its long 75mm gun began to traverse, searching for the source of the shot. "Panther. 11 o'clock. Russo yelled. "Loader, Sabo. Move." The duel was on. The German gun flashed. A split second later, a shell screamed past their turret, So close Art felt the wind of its passage, and slammed into a pine tree behind them, exploding it into a shower of splinters. The Avenger shuddered from the concussive force. They had survived the first shot by sheer luck. They wouldn't survive a second. Traverse right. Steady. Steady. Russo's voice was a controlled scream. The hydraulic traverse whined, the honey-lubricated mechanism moving slower than it should. The Panther was already reloading, its superior German optics giving it a deadly advantage. He's hull down. All I can see is his turret front. Delgado shouted. The frontal armor of the Panther's turret was virtually impervious to their 76mm gun at this range. Art's mind, trained to assess land and angle, clicked into gear. He wasn't a gunner, but he was a man who understood trajectories. Sarge. The ground. He's on a downslope. If we hit the ground right in front of his hull, the round might ricochet up into his soft underbelly. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. A farmer's trick, Part 2. Russo didn't hesitate. You heard him, Delgado. Aim for the dirt. 10 feet in front of his tracks. Fire on my mark. The world narrowed to the inside of that steel box. The smell of honey, cordite, and sweat was thick. Riley slammed the last of their sabot rounds into the breech. Up. The Panther's gun was almost on them. Art could see the crewman in the Panther's commander cupola, a tiny, faceless figure. Mark. Delgado fired. The shot was different this time, a clean, sharp crack. The armor-piercing shell, a needle of tungsten and steel, left the barrel at over 2,600 feet per second. It hit the frozen earth exactly where Delgado had aimed. Instead of burying itself, it skipped, deflecting upward on the hard, frozen ground. It struck the Panther at a shallow angle, not on the impenetrable front plate, but underneath it, piercing the thin armor of the hull floor. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a jet of orange flame shot out from underneath the German tank. A moment later, its ammunition cooked off. A series of internal explosions tore the Panther apart from the inside out, its turret blowing clean off and landing with a ground-shaking crash 20 yards away. A roaring inferno replaced the once predatory machine. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning Panther. No one in the Nebraska Avenger spoke. They had just done the impossible. With a stupid trick and a 1-in-a-million shot, they had slain a giant. The silence after the battle was heavier than the noise that preceded it. The only sounds were the mournful wind whistling through the shell holes in their hull and the hungry crackle of the Panther's funeral pyre. They sat there, shrouded in smoke and exhaustion, the adrenaline receding to leave a hollow, trembling void. Medics from the other tanks were moving among the infantry positions now, their voices low and urgent. The sight of the destroyed Panther had broken the German assault, but the cost was written in the blood staining the snow. Art climbed out of the driver's hatch, the cold air a shocking slap after the tank's stifling interior. He looked at the jar in his hand, still sticky with the golden residue that had saved them. Sergeant Russo clapped a hand on his shoulder, his face grimy and etched with a fatigue no sleep could cure. "Miller," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You and your mom's damn honey." He shook his head in disbelief. "I'm putting it in the log. I'm telling every tank commander I see." The trick spread through the battered American lines like wildfire. At first, it was met with the same skepticism Art's crew had shown. But as the brutal winter wore on, and more guns froze, desperate men tried it. They used it on M1 Garans, on Browning machine guns, on artillery pieces. The simple, homespun wisdom from a Nebraska beekeeper kept countless weapons firing. It was a tiny golden thread in the vast, dark tapestry of the Battle of the Bulge, but it was a thread that helped hold the line. It saved lives. It saved a sector. It contributed, in its own small way, to the eventual victory that saved millions. Weeks later, when the skies finally cleared and the Allied counteroffensive began, Art found a quiet moment. He sat on the fender of the repaired Nebraska Avenger, the winter sun weak but welcome on his face. He took out the last of the honey and smeared it on a piece of hardtack. He closed his eyes as he ate it, and for a single, fleeting moment, he was not in the scarred forests of Belgium. He was home. The taste was of clover and sunshine, of his mother's smile, of Clara's laugh, of a promise of a future he now dared to believe he might see. In that simple, sweet taste, he found the reason for all of it. The silence around him was no longer heavy with death, but filled with a fragile, precious hope of peace. This is the story of how a farmer's stupid trick helped save a generation. If you believe in honoring the ingenuity and sacrifice of our greatest generation, subscribe and share this story, so their legacy is never forgotten.